I'm going to put my hand up, ladies and gentlemen, and say that until recently I was one of those secularists who've been rather getting it in the neck this afternoon, who came late to the notion that the religions to which people subscribe today actually matter. And what led me to join in this renewal of interest in religion in the late modern world that Grace talked about actually wasn't anything that's been happening in the contemporary world. It wasn't the Iranian Revolution or the Rushdie Affair or 9/11 or anything like that. It was actually very perversely immersing myself in the world of the classical Greeks and Romans. Because if the West has always been shaped by Jerusalem, so also since the time of Jerome has it been recognised that it is shaped by Athens. And as a child, I had absolutely no doubt where my primary loyalties lay. I frankly found the Greek gods vastly sexier than the Old Testament God. I preferred togas to tea towels. I found Socrates and Virgil vastly more sympathetic as characters than Jeremiah or St. Paul. And so it was that when I came to write my first works of history, Rubicon and Persian Fire, available from all good bookshops, my first book was about the fall of the Roman Republic. My second book was about the great wars between Greece and Persia in the 5th century BC. So both of them were BC. They were before Christ. But the experience of writing those books and immersing myself in the world vision of people who had existed before Christianity, paradoxically, was to make me increasingly aware of how unbelievably Christian in my ethics, my morals, and presumptions that I was. And so having written those first two books, I then took a slight detour, because what interested me was to understand, well, what happened to this world that was so different to the world that we inhabit now in terms of its morals and its ethics? And I think that actually we've been talking about this process of secularization, the degree to which people in the West have got out of the habit of thinking religiously. But what strikes me from the context of looking at a pre-Christian world is how unbelievably Christian our entire society remains in its most fundamental sense. For instance, the issue we're focusing on today, the issue of security. Who says violence is a bad thing? The Greeks and the Romans didn't necessarily. Athens was named after a warrior goddess. The father of the Roman people was Mars, the war god. The presumption that violence, that war, is a bad thing essentially derives from the example of Christ telling Peter to put up his sword, I think. Likewise, the idea that the welfare state matters, the thing that is the great topic of the general election. Woohoo, we're looking forward to that. The Greeks and the Romans didn't give a toss about the sick, about the weak, about the poor. And in fact, archaeologically, you can tell when a city in the Roman Empire has become Christian, because instead of finding triumphal arches or amphitheatres in which gladiators were slaughtered, you start finding hospitals and schools and old people's homes, which had not existed before. And most dramatically of all, I think, is the other idea that we're talking about today, secularism. Where does that come from? Well, again, there was no understanding of a division between the secular and the religious in the pre-Christian world. The roots of our understanding of the secular derive ultimately from the famous response of Christ to the question of whether they should pay taxes. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God. And in the West, that ultimately took a very distinctive form, focused by what used to be a very famous event, Canossa, where an emperor waited in the snow to be blessed by the Pope, Gregory VII in the 11th century. And what happened in the 11th century and then into the 12th was that essentially the Catholic Church absorbed what had previously been the sacral powers of kings and emperors into itself, thereby clearing up a space which could become what we now see as secular. And one fruit of that, most intriguingly of all, was our current understanding of religion. Because if I said there was no notion of secular in the classical world, neither was there a concept of the religious. And what happened in the Protestant Reformation, and I mention that because if we are a Christian country, I think also in our presumptions we remain largely a Protestant country. What happened was that a notion of something called religion, derived from the Latin religio, but that's not, in Roman times and in medieval times, religio did not have the sense that religion has now. That modern sense that we have evolves post-Protestantism, and essentially it is an invention of the Reformation and Enlightenment worlds. And the paradox of that is that, in a sense, when we talk about religious literacy, we need to bear in mind, we need to be literate about the nature of religion. We need to recognise that, like secularism, it is a word that carries a lot of cultural baggage. And that therefore, when Westerners, Western journalists, Western academics, whoever, apply religion, that Western concept as it exists within the English language and many other European languages, to other areas of the world, they are seeing through a glass darkly. We cannot help it. We are conditioned by our language and everything that it determines. And so therefore I think that when, for instance, we look at two of the most pressing trouble spots in the world at the moment, we are looking at areas that are not shaped by that Western Christian Protestant tradition. And I think it makes it hard for us to get a handle on it. The first that Marit was talking about, obviously, is Crimea, Ukraine. Christian, absolutely, but shaped very much not by the Latin West, but by Byzantine traditions, to complement the
not at all. But
we'll come to that in a minute. But when you the person you quoted, was it Putin was talking about?
That's Putin. That's not science.
There's a wonderful phrase from Potemkin writing to Catherine II when she absorbed Crimea, and referred not only to Vladimir, Prince of Kiev, but also to the Greeks and the Romans who had been there. So it was laying claim to the classical heritage as well. And I think that whether we think it's Byzantine or not, I think nevertheless the Orthodox traditions are recognisably different to those of the Latin West. And therefore it is a challenge for us, I think, to recognise that Russian Christianity or Ukrainian Christianity is not necessarily the same as Western Christianity. But it's even more evident, I think, this problem in the Middle East, and particularly the rise of ISIS, because there is a temptation for us in the West always to maybe to blame ourselves. So, for instance, it is very evident that when ISIS have pulled down the frontier posts that exist between Iraq and Syria, they've been very upfront about it. They are erasing the Sykes-Picot border. Great triumph. But there is also an element in which they are going back to the 7th century, and they are erasing that border that existed between the two great empires of the pre-Islamic world, Rome and Persia. And that is the context in which they are operating. The early Muslims, the first Arab conquerors, totally annihilated the Persian Empire. They swallowed it up. But Rome, in the form of Constantinople, the second Rome, stood strong. And so Rome, the new Rome, the second Rome, in the demonology of early Islam, apocalyptic Islam, was the great foe. And again, it's not surprising that in one of the recent editions of Dabiq, the ISIS glossy magazine, lifestyle magazine, they had a picture of Caligula's obelisk in the front of St. Peter's Square with the ISIS flag flying on. And there is great talk in ISIS. The ambition is to conquer Rome, by which, of course, they mean America, but they do also, I think, literally mean to conquer Rome. And Mustafa said, absolutely right, that there is no tradition in Islamic scholarship to justify what ISIS are doing. But in a sense, I think that is the whole point, because what ISIS are doing is to strip away, as they see it, the cladding of commentary, the cladding of tradition, and in a sense go back to the primal sources, to the primal fountainhead of the example of the prophet and the early caliphs. And I think it is part of the fascination and the complexity of this issue that when you do that, when you do actually go back and attempt to do that, to go back to an understanding of what actually happened in the 7th and the 8th centuries, you can come to almost diametrically opposed conclusions. You can, for instance, have the form of Islam that is manifest in the Islamic State. You can justify, if you want to, the slaughter of Yazidis in the name of following the example of the Prophet overthrowing idols. You can justify crucifixions and beheadings with reference to the verses of the Quran. You can claim that the reason this hasn't been done before is because people in the Islamic State in the early 21st century uniquely have managed to see through all the fog of previous Islamic commentary to get back to the primal example of those early Muslims. Alternatively, if you look back to the beginnings of Islam and you try and strip away the cladding, you can find something very different. You can find that actually it's almost impossible to get back to the historical truth of who the Prophet was and what the early Muslims were doing. You can see in the fighting that was taking place in the very lands that ISIS now occupy between the Byzantines and the early Arabs. You can see scholars who were looking around to try and construct an example that would justify their understanding of jihad, which is not implicit within the Quran. It had to be formulated over the course of the 8th century. And you can discover that actually what happened in the 8th century was that to justify what these warrior scholars were doing, these prototypes of the kind of people who are now going to northern Syria and to Iraq to fight, that what they did was to construct a biography of Muhammad that would enable them to claim that what they were doing was following his example. So I think that that is part of both the challenge and the fascination of looking at religion in the context of these ongoing stories, is that it's not just about remembering to bear in mind religion, to remember that you've got to keep the fact that some people believe in certain gods or follow certain rules or are versed in certain texts. You've got to recognise that religions themselves are vastly more complicated than most of us, I think, recognise, and certainly that I had recognised before I came to the brain-achingly complex task of trying to understand them in their context, let alone in the present day. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to close by invoking the thoughts of a second poet, if I may, this time an American, Mary Oliver, who has a very useful set of instructions for living a life. Her instructions for living a life are: pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. You have indeed attended today. Thank you for your attendance. I trust on occasion you've been astonished. I've been astonished at the power of simple testimony, the wonderful stories that we heard. That's the first thing that I was astonished by. The second thing is I've been astonished by the directness with which we've been able to talk about these things. And that's in part due to the safety and security that we all experience in this country. And I've been astonished too by the value of seeing things in greater contexts. I loved what Dr. Merritt said when he said that in introducing a discussion of the Ukraine, which was so refreshing to hear in this setting. His plea was that multiple confusions in the Ukraine all have their logics. So all the multiple confusions that you have experienced and heard about, they all have their logics. So you've attended, and I hope that you've been astonished, and I'd love you now to go and tell others about it. So, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance, thank you for your astonishment, and thank you for now for your enthusiasm.